My mother-in-law's entitlement knows no bounds, and it's been a constant source of strain on our marriage. My wife's unwavering support and enabling behavior towards her mother have only made things harder for us. Despite my efforts to address the issue with my wife, she seems blind to her mother's behavior, always quick to defend her actions and brush off any concerns I raise. It's as if she's afraid to confront her mother or set boundaries, fearing conflict or upsetting her. For context, when I started dating my wife, she was quite upfront to me about her family situation. My wife's family used to be really wealthy, but because of poor financial decisions, they lost everything. My wife has told me how both of her parents would gamble away their money. They also had expensive tastes like buying boats or expensive sports cars, which they clearly could not afford and had to take loans. They could never repay their loans on time, which pushed them further into debt. Eventually, the situation got so worse that they had to downsize from their mansion into a condo. However, my wife still believes that it wasn't really her parents' fault and that they provided her with everything when the opposite is true. When I met my wife, it was she who was providing for her parents instead of the other way around. She has told me stories of how her mother would force her into participating in beauty pageants and would then take the reward money to use it to buy drinks or splurge on trips, leaving my wife behind with her grandparents. My wife also remembers that during her 16th birthday, she had gotten some money from family members for her birthday. Mother-in-law forced her to give her the money by guilt-tripping her about how she needed the money more than her. Later, my mother-in-law used the money to get a perm, according to my wife. When she confronted her mother about it, her mother-in-law told her that she raised her and fed her, so she deserved the money. Her father was no better either. He got another woman pregnant and had to pay child support. However, when my wife got a job at 18, he started asking her to pay his child support. He would constantly trouble my wife to buy him a new TV or fridge at their house. If she ever refused, he would get violent and threaten to smash her phone and laptop. It was only after she moved out of her parents' place that she gained some independence in her life. Compared to my wife's parents, my own parents are quite different. I grew up in a lower middle class family and we lived in a trailer park initially. I admit that my parents didn't have a lot. However, they were the sort of people who would have given me the clothes off their backs if I needed it. My dad worked as a mechanic while my mother worked as a diner. Both of them worked hard to save money so they could send me to school and buy my books. I had a good life despite how much we had to struggle. However, when I did get a job and saved up enough over the years, I bought a house for them, which my dad refused to accept until I practically had to beg him. They shed tears of joy as it was their dream to own a house one day, and they could not believe that their son had done it. Apart from the house, my parents have never asked me for money. They still do part-time jobs so they can live with what they have. So I have no issues sending them money. They always insist that as parents, they should look after me and not the other way around. Hence, as you can imagine, when I learned how my wife's parents were completely the opposite, it took some time for me to adjust. When my wife introduced me to her family, his mother looked me up and down and asked me if I was rich or not. I was taken aback by how blunt she was. I replied back that I had a good job and I earned well. After that, she would take every opportunity to ask me about my finances. She would ask if I had insurance or if I was investing my money somewhere. Her questions were always borderline invasive and would make me extremely uncomfortable. I would tell my wife, and she did ask her mother to stop. However, my mother-in-law then started asking me these questions subtly when my wife wasn't around me. She would ask me if I had any loans, and when I told her that I had paid off everything, she immediately started saying how I should help my wife pay off everything since I have so much. Keep in mind that at that time my wife and I were just dating, so this was an extremely inappropriate thing for her to say. She would then ask me if I have parents and if I gave any money to my parents. I had enough and told her that I didn't wish to discuss my personal life with her. I would notice how my mother-in-law would call my wife every other week and ask her for $1,000 or $1,500. It would always be the same pattern. She would call my wife crying and pleading for money. My wife would try to tell her how she's trying to save money, and mother-in-law would promise to pay her money back. However, she never did. If my wife ever asked her about it, my mother-in-law would yell at her for being ungrateful and selfish. Later, she would call back and apologize, and then a few days later, she would again ask for money. Every time my wife lost her money to my mother-in-law, she would come and complain to me about it for hours on end. But if I said a single word agreeing with her, she would immediately tell me how she can talk like that about her mother, but I can't say anything. Hence, I asked her to stop telling me about her mother borrowing money from her after that, because like a fool, she kept giving and it was starting to irritate me. When we got married, my wife wanted a lavish wedding and went all out. I agreed to pay for everything because I could afford to do so. However, the only thing I asked from her was to sign a prenup. Now, I know this can be a touchy subject, but watching her family take everything from her, I was afraid that she would also turn into them, and slowly I could not take any chances. However, my wife found this very offending and threatened to break up with them, telling me how marriage is built on trust and I don't trust her. She even got her mother involved, who berated me for even suggesting a prenup. My mother-in-law told me that their family has honor and integrity, so I had nothing to worry about. I pointed out to her about how she herself never paid back her daughter after borrowing money, which pissed off both my wife and mother-in-law. My wife packed her bags and left me, telling me how I had insulted her pride and family, and that she didn't need me. I was heartbroken and tried to explain to her that my intention was not to question her loyalty or commitment, but rather to safeguard our mutual interests. I wanted us to enter into marriage with open eyes and clear expectations, free from the shadow of any potential disputes over assets. However, she didn't listen and just left. A week later, she was at my doorstep begging me to take her back. When I asked her about what had happened, she informed me that mother-in-law and father-in-law had asked her to give them her paychecks every month, telling her how they wanted to take care of her finances. She told me that she had realized her mistake and begged me to forgive her, telling me how she wanted to take back everything that she had told me. She agreed to sign a prenup, so we got back together. For our wedding, we had no choice but to invite mother-in-law and father-in-law, since it was a big day for my wife and she wanted them there. However, that might have been a big mistake, because that was the day that my in-laws realized just how rich I am. They were shocked to see the lavish decorations, wedding band, and the huge 8-tier cake that my wife wanted. Ever since the wedding, my mother-in-law would call me directly to request me to buy her things or cover expenses for services she or her household uses. Sometimes she even asks for cash. I would try to tell her how I am not obligated to pay, but she would then start begging me, saying how she's old and weak and that as my wife's husband, I can help her out here and there, and I would begrudgingly agree, because I thought I did have enough anyway, so it would not really harm me. One day, out of the blue, she asked me to buy her a brand new refrigerator because she wasn't fond of the perfectly functional one she had. When I questioned why she wasn't turning to her own child, or her husband for help. She justified it by saying that I earn a decent income and therefore I should have a responsibility to cover her expenses in some way. I refused, so she started to cry and told my wife that if I didn't pay for it, then she had to. I knew my wife earned significantly less than me, so she would have to dip into her savings just to buy her mother a refrigerator. In the end, I ended up buying my mother-in-law the refrigerator she wanted just to shut her up. Another time my mother-in-law showed her true colors was when my parents ordered me and my wife new sweaters for our anniversary. My father had sent me pictures of the sweater and I knew what they looked like. When I received the package, I had kept it in our garage as my parents wanted me to surprise my wife on our anniversary. Well, on the day of our anniversary, I searched everywhere in the garage and I could not find the package. I was perplexed and I asked my wife if she had perhaps thrown away the package. I was so confused as to how a package had just disappeared from our house until a month later I saw the same sweaters while I was visiting my in-laws. Furious at the revelation, I wasted no time in confronting my mother-in-law about the stolen sweaters. She resisted, but eventually confessed that she had been visiting my wife at the time and had wandered into our garage. She took it upon herself to rummage through our belongings, discovering the package I had hidden from my wife. In a brazen display of entitlement, she admitted that she assumed I had discarded it. Hence, she decided to take it. I was so furious that I yelled at her that her actions were not only a gross invasion of privacy, but also a blatant violation of our trust. I firmly told her that she had no right to roam freely through our home, let alone help herself to anything without our explicit consent. However, instead of feeling ashamed or even apologizing, she dismissed my outrage with a scoff, arrogantly asserting that the sweaters she had stolen from me were of subpar quality anyway. She told me that she did me a favor by taking those sweaters from me. Her callous indifference only fueled my fury. I shot back, telling her that those sweaters were anniversary gifts from my parents and meant a lot to me. I took back the sweaters from her and told my wife that we were leaving. On the way back home, my wife chastised me for making an issue out of nothing. She told me how her mother clearly had mistakenly taken the package, so I should not have embarrassed her like that. I was really shocked that even when her mother had clearly stolen from me, my wife refused to see it. My wife tried to say how her mother didn't mean any harm and was probably confused. However, I felt disgusted and violated after what her mother had done. As if this incident wasn't enough, last year, my mother-in-law came to my wife asking her to buy her a dishwasher. It was a baffling appeal, considering their household comprised just 2 individuals, and my father-in-law often spent his evenings away from home reveling in the company of his friends at a local bar. My wife tried to tell her this. However, my mother-in-law insisted that every one of their neighbors had one, and she felt embarrassed about being the only house without a dishwasher. When my wife kept refusing, my mother-in-law got pissed and told her that she wished she was never born because any other child would listen to their parents and buy them whatever they needed. This really hurt my wife, and she spent the rest of the evening crying. I had stopped talking to my mother-in-law after the sweater incident, however. The next day she messaged me telling me how I should help out my wife, in this case by buying a dishwasher for my mother-in-law. I couldn't believe the audacity she had to keep asking me for stuff. Her blatant disregard for boundaries and insistence on involving me in her schemes left me seething with frustration. I chose to ignore her message, leaving it unread, as I refused to be dragged into another one of her manipulative ploys. Later, when I shared the message with my wife, she revealed that she had already dipped into her savings to fulfill her mother's request. I felt drained and completely fed up with all the drama that my mother-in-law kept bringing into our lives. Recently, my father-in-law passed away. His drinking problem ended up causing his death. It's sad because he was found on the streets and no one had bothered to help him out throughout the night. In the wake of his passing, my mother-in-law found herself in an incredibly difficult situation. Not only was she grappling with the shock and grief of losing her husband, but she also faced the daunting task of settling his affairs. It became apparent that my father-in-law had accumulated a significant amount of debt, including debts to loan sharks. With no other recourse, my mother-in-law had to make the tough decision to sell off their possessions in order to pay off his debts. Ultimately, my wife and I made the difficult decision to take in my mother-in-law because she had nowhere else to turn. At first I thought, let bygones be bygones, and I welcomed my mother-in-law with open arms, thinking it would be nice to have her around. However, old habits die hard because I would constantly find her rummaging through our belongings whenever we were not around. If I confronted her about it, she would tell me that she was just being curious. I would tell my wife to talk to her mother, but she would tell me to just let mother be as she was going through a rough time. However, I just couldn't shake it off as it felt like an invasion of privacy and it left me feeling uneasy. As time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were disappearing from our home. Expensive items and cherished pieces of china seemed to vanish without explanation. What puzzled me further was that whenever these items went missing, my mother-in-law would return home with shopping bags in tow. Given her financial situation, it became increasingly apparent that she was selling off our possessions to fund her shopping sprees. Over the weeks, I noticed her accumulating a wardrobe of new dresses and matching heels despite her lack of income. When I pointed this out to my wife, she dismissed my worries, urging me to stop focusing on her mother and let her be. While I didn't mind my mother-in-law treating herself, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was essentially stealing from us to finance her shopping habits. It was a frustrating situation that left me feeling powerless, especially with my wife downplaying the severity of the issue. One day I arrived home early from work before my wife and headed to our bedroom to take a shower, as was my routine. Upon stepping out, I was startled to find my mother-in-law rifling through my wallet. Shocked, I yelled at her, asking her what she was even doing in our bedroom. She went red in embarrassment as she struggled to respond. Later, when I shared the incident with my wife, I hoped for support and understanding, and instead she brushed off my concerns, defending her mother's actions and downplaying the severity of the situation. To my disbelief, she even suggested that it wasn't a big deal for her mother to take cash from my wallet if she needed it, and that I should stop trying to be so controlling. I was taken aback by how she was trying to gaslight me when in fact she should have held her own mother accountable for her actions. My wife then went on to say how I should stop looking down on her family and that her family didn't grow up low class and desperate like mine. Sarah's response caught me off guard, leaving me feeling upset and confused. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. As I wandered outside for hours, I couldn't understand why Sarah was so protective of her mother, especially when her mother's actions didn't deserve it. I had expected support, not denial. It felt like there was a big problem in our relationship and I needed time alone to figure things out. Later, when I returned home, my wife apologized to me. She said she had a firm talk with her mother, telling her not to enter our bedroom anymore and not to go through our things. I simply nodded, feeling resigned because I didn't see any other solution. Despite my wife's conversation with her, my mother-in-law's intrusive behavior didn't stop. I caught her twice more, once in the living room at 3 a.m. and another time rummaging through my trophies and old certificates in the garage. It seemed like no matter what we said or did, she couldn't respect our boundaries. I decided that I would install locks in my drawers just in case so that she couldn't go through them anymore. Yesterday, while I was at the office, my wife called me in a panic. She informed me that she had gone back home for lunch and had discovered that mother-in-law was nowhere to be found. She looked for her everywhere and noticed that her belongings were all gone. Feeling uneasy, my wife decided to check if anything significant was missing from our home. It was then that she made a troubling discovery. Her credit card and jewelry were missing. She told me how her mother is refusing to pick up her calls, and she is worried that my mother-in-law might misuse the card and pawn off her jewelry. She asked me for help, but I told her that all she could do was call the police and report her mother. Hearing this, my wife got pissed and told me that she could not just report her mother, and yelled at me for not helping her out. Honestly, I have no idea what I can do in such a situation anyway, when her own mother has stolen from her. I am thankful that I didn't leave behind my card at home and I had put locks on my drawers. Otherwise, my mother-in-law might have stolen from me as well. Since yesterday, my wife has been in a state of panic, understandably worried about her mother's sudden disappearance and the potential misuse of her belongings. However, every time I suggest contacting the police for assistance, she becomes defensive and lashes out at me. As a result, I've been trying to tread carefully and keep my thoughts to myself, feeling frustrated and powerless. AITA for suggesting involving the police in this case? I mean, isn't that what people do in these cases? Update 1. Well, thank you everyone for proving me right. I am shocked by the overwhelming response since I hardly use Reddit, but I am also surprised that some of you have pointed out how toxic my wife is. After reading through all the comments, I acknowledge that my wife isn't flawless and tends to be overly protective of her mother. Despite this, our relationship is generally free of conflicts. However, I understand the valid concerns raised here and I intend to address them with my wife. It's clear that as long as my mother-in-law remains a part of our lives, we'll likely encounter ongoing disputes as she consistently disregards our boundaries and my wife downplays her behavior. Update 2. So I talked with my wife and even showed her this post. In short, she expressed displeasure with the responses under my post so far and told me that she feels unfairly attacked and misunderstood. In a heated exchange, she accused me of portraying her unfairly and became defensive, insisting that anyone in her position would feel compelled to help out their parents regardless of the circumstances. She told me that I should not have publicly written about our family issues on Reddit. She feels betrayed and has questioned my judgment, arguing that such matters should be kept private. I tried to explain to her that my intention was simply to seek advice on whether my suggestion to involve the police was appropriate or not, but she remained adamant in her stance. Her response has left me feeling disheartened and further alienated in our relationship. I don't understand why she keeps blaming me when she should be blaming the main culprit, my mother-in-law. Update 3. It's been a week since my last update. My wife has finally got in touch with mother-in-law. Turns out that she has already pawned off half of her jewelry and insists on living on her own from now on. She told my wife that she is tired of living with her since she can't drink or smoke anymore and wants to have her own place. My wife threatened to involve the police if her belongings weren't returned, but it seems my mother-in-law isn't fazed by the ultimatum, possibly aware that they are all empty threats. My wife is insisting that I talk to my mother-in-law and make her see the light, but I told her that I want to stay out of it. Since then, my wife has told me that maybe it's all my fault that my mother-in-law left us since I made her feel so unwelcome. I am seriously at a loss for words. Update 4. I know it's been a while since I gave any update, but if you are still wondering about me, I wanted to let you all know that I am going to be divorcing my wife. I know a lot of people saw this coming, and now I wish I had listened to their warnings to spare myself from all of this hardship. After my mother-in-law stole my wife's card and jewelry, my wife was able to block her card before my mother-in-law could withdraw a significant amount of money. However, she couldn't retrieve her stolen jewelry. I urged her to involve the police, but she refused and instead blamed me for everything. However, what has now pushed me over the edge is that my wife came to me asking me to replace all her stolen jewelry. She argued that since my mother-in-law stole from her and left us because I made her feel unwelcome, it was now my responsibility to replace what was stolen. Firstly, those pieces of jewelry were gifts that I had lovingly given her over the years. Secondly, it was her mother who took them, and she refused to involve the authorities. Now, she expects me to foot the bill for replacing them, so I obviously refused, and told her that I had enough of her and her family. We fought, and she called my family a bunch of names, which pissed me off more, so I asked her to pack her bags and leave. She was shocked that I could even suggest something like this and told me how unfair I was being. I stood by my decision and asked her to leave immediately, so she had no choice but to pack her bags while cursing me out loud and leaving to live with her mom. Update 4. Since my wife left me, I have been getting calls and messages from both her and my mother-in-law accusing me of being heartless and cruel. My wife even had the audacity to call my parents and involve them in all this. Thankfully, my parents are not like hers. My mother told her straight away that even though she didn't know the reason behind our separation, she did trust my decision implicitly. It's comforting to know that my parents have my back, even though I haven't fully confided in them yet. I have been taking some time to process my emotions, but their understanding and support mean the world to me. Meanwhile, I am going to be talking to a divorce lawyer today regarding filing for divorce. I have listened to your advice and I have changed all my locks. I've also ordered cameras for my property from Amazon, which I plan on installing this week. There is a chance that mother-in-law or my wife might try to break in, so I need to be prepared just in case. Update 5. It's been 2 months since my last update, and something unexpected has just happened. My mother-in-law has been arrested. For the past 2 months, she has been stalking me relentlessly, showing up unexpectedly at my office or when I'm out with friends. It's been a constant source of stress and discomfort. On one occasion, things escalated when she threw her soda at me, ruining my sweater. Despite my efforts to handle the situation civilly, her behavior only grew more erratic. She began showing up at my house uninvited, even going so far as to throw rocks at my window. Today, her actions reached a dangerous level when she broke one of the windows in my bedroom. Fearing for my safety and unable to tolerate her harassment any longer, I immediately called the police to intervene. It was a difficult decision, but I knew I needed to take action to protect myself and put an end to her alarming behavior. My soon-to-be ex-wife has reached out to me telling me how big of an a-hole I am for involving the police. She told me that I could have resolved this situation privately and told me how mother-in-law was going through a tough time. I simply laughed at her and told her that her mother deserved what was coming for her. She wants me to forgive her mother, however, after enduring weeks of harassment and witnessing her mother's increasingly dangerous behavior. Forgiveness is the furthest thing from my mind. Also, I did have a conversation with my parents about everything. They are shocked that I had kept everything hidden from them for so long. They assured me that I was right in getting a divorce from my wife. After my mother-in-law's stalking incident, I have told my parents to be extra careful, although I doubt my mother-in-law or my wife will even show up at their place since they live quite far away. In the aftermath of involving the police, my wife had to release her mother on bail. I made it clear to her that she needed to pay me for the broken window, otherwise I would take her to small claims court. Begrudgingly, my wife and her mother eventually agreed to cover the costs of repairing the broken window. It seemed they finally recognized that I wasn't going to back down anymore and were willing to make amends. Update 6. I am finally divorced. It's been a long, challenging journey, but as I sit down to write this, I can't help but feel an overwhelming sense of joy and relief. It's as if I've emerged from a long, dark tunnel and finally glimpsed the light at the end. My gold digger wife did try to come after my money, however. Since we have a prenup and we don't have any children, her request for alimony was denied. She kept begging and arguing, but no one listened to her. I'm incredibly grateful that I had the foresight to insist on a prenuptial agreement. Without it, I could have been faced with the prospect of having to part with half of my assets. Here's a reminder to anyone who may be contemplating whether or not to get a prenuptial agreement. Don't hesitate. While it may seem like a difficult conversation to have, it's an important step in protecting yourself and your assets. Remember that it's always better to be prepared. Stay tuned for more stories from Argo Relationships.